Welcome very much to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I'm excited for our guest today, Navi Pillay. She is a former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And over the course of her storied career, she has acted as a defense attorney for anti-apartheid activists. She was appointed as acting judge on the South African High Court. And in the same year was also elected to the United Nations General Assembly to be a judge on the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where she served for a total of 8 years, the last 4 of which she was the president. She also played a critical role in the ICTR's groundbreaking jurisprudence on rape as genocide, as well as on issues of freedom of speech and hate propaganda. And in 2003, she was appointed as a judge on the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where she served in the appeals chamber until August of 2008. In South Africa, as a member of the Women's National Coalition, she contributed to the inclusion of equality, or an equality clause in the country's constitution that prohibits discrimination on grounds of race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. She also co-founded Equality Now, an international women's rights organization, and has been involved with other organizations working on issues relating to children, detainees, victims of torture and of domestic violence, and a range of economic, cultural, and social issues. Navi, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kristan. This is a very exciting experience. I can't see students, but I know they're there.
Yes, we have a wide audience. It's been very interesting, these teas. Let's start with, I think, a threshold question. So we have billed this talk as human rights in a pandemic. And certainly not only in the United States, but around the world, there have been a lot of conversations about what the government can or cannot tell people to do and how that impacts their rights. So maybe we start with the threshold of, do emergency orders and quarantines necessarily violate human rights?
Yes, unfortunately they do. This is why we all oppose the emergency and emergency laws, and why we all support the rule of law, because the rule of law protects human rights. And emergencies deviate, they derogate from the rule of law. But many countries have now declared disaster or emergency situations, and they have adopted confinement and other restrictions that may restrict human rights and freedoms of speech, assembly, and movement. So therefore, generally speaking, there is a risk of human rights violations when the authorities give themselves powers outside the rule of law. But in the case of the COVID pandemic, we all accept that these extraordinary emergency measures are needed to safeguard us against this killer virus. And all of us are not, well, none of us is immune to this virus, and the virus doesn't respect borders. So states can take these measures, even international law allows it, but international law has safeguards built in. So if we look at, for instance, the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, Article 4 sets out the conditions, namely that the measures are necessary to combat the public health crisis. The measures are reasonable and proportionate and are lifted as soon as they are no longer necessary in protecting public health. So those are the immediate safeguards. It has to be necessary, proportionate, and temporary. And I would add, these measures have to be based on scientific evidence. There must be wide consultation of all stakeholders, including civil societies and local communities, to this response. And it must be grounded on protection of human rights, of all, upholding the intrinsic right of every human being, leaving no one behind. So many of the complaints are about this. A, we're not consulted. 2, some of these measures are overreaching and do not make sense. And we don't trust the data. We don't trust this authoritarian process. These are many complaints. So can I just jump in? I'm speaking, as you know, from Durban, South Africa.
Yes.
So, yeah, so yesterday the minister announced all these measures on what businesses can sell since re-entering into winter. He named the items. All right, you can only sell these winter clothing. And back came the question, well, can we sell T-shirts? Because people wear T-shirts inside the winter clothing. Oh, all right, you can sell T-shirts. Yeah, well, can we sell open shoes, or must they be closed shoes? So this is a ridiculous level where there is micromanagement on the part of the executive. And this is not my idea of consultation and getting people on board and having your measures be reasonable.
Yep. So it sounds as if there's a balance. So in general, if I'm going to rephrase what you said a little bit. So yes, these rules do limit some human rights, but there is a recognition that at least some level at this point, there are some guidelines that are necessary to help stop the spread of the disease and help curtail it. And so what we need to be careful of is going back to sort of the 4 principles that you mentioned. Are they reasonably tied to that protection effort? Are they not overly broad? Or is the public aware of them, or has there been some sort of consultation about it? And that they're not, I think, not targeting any one particular group or one particular business or a group of people that seems to disadvantage them.
Yeah, are they necessary to protect human rights?
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, so that level of specificity that you were just mentioning seems, to perhaps be a step too far, as opposed to, yes, shops can now open, and maybe you need to just be mindful of how many people are in the store, kind of guideline.
Yeah.
So we talked about those kind of rules. There also have been certainly in the U.S., and I've seen reports from around the world about how people who have contracted the coronavirus, are being treated, and then also separately what governments are doing in order to be able to trace their whereabouts or trace whom they've come in contact with. Why don't we talk about that in regards to human rights, the impact on privacy and that?
Well, during the discussions in the Human Rights Council in April on COVID and human rights, this was the focus, that there should not be an invasion of the right to privacy, and there should not be a derogation from freedom of speech. There was much concern with the fact that journalists or critics, civil society, who have commented or criticized these pandemic measures in certain countries are being harassed, threatened, thrown out, in some cases even detained. So that's about the worst scenario. And speakers highlighted this in specific country situations. That has to end. Now, with regard to contact tracking, we're all concerned about that, and the later use of this technology to suit these kind of governments who want much more out of our private lives. Yes, states must ensure that any use of surveillance and technical tools to track the spread of the virus is limited in purpose and duration, and must abide by the strictest protections, and must only be made available under the national laws that are consistent with international standards. So that's important, not just any law, but they must be compliant with international standards. And that is the guarantees of the individual's right to privacy must be preserved. That's one. There must be non-discrimination, protection of journalists' sources, and other freedoms must be rigorously protected.
How do we handle that within the realm of, obviously there are different types of government across the world. And so what ability does each nation have for its own sovereign determination in something like that? Or are these more universal rights, and so need to perhaps, I'm thinking of some authoritarian regimes, that this is a challenge for them, the recognition of this right to privacy is not in their interest. It's not how they operate.
Yes, so that's why I welcome the discussion among states themselves. First, they have to undertake that obligation to respect the international standard. And that was done when the resolution was adopted before the Human Rights Council. So all states were there. They undertook that they will observe the standards even in tracking, contact tracking for this and for future use. However, we have to be realistic enough to know that it's happening. There are countries, why else would they shut their journalists out? Why else would they not be transparent about statistics and so on? They could keep so much away from us. And so there I always look at discussions such as this, robust discussions that flesh these risks out. I respect activism on the part of civil society. Now, civil society is very resilient and vigilant on these issues. So they come up with the facts. I've looked at some of the websites of some of the main NGOs, International Services for Human Rights, for instance. They name the countries, they name individuals who are deviating from the standards. So they are a wonderful source of monitoring implementation. Media, of course, is our number one source. This is why we have to ensure that media is not restricted in any way from reporting the facts to us.
Mm-hmm. And so for the journalists and the NGOs who are bringing to light those who are perhaps not abiding by these rules and these guidelines, what are possible next courses of action?
Well, firstly, we have to make the violation public and demand their release. I know of 2 cases where they were deported, right? Russia has deported foreign journalists, Egypt has. Burundi has deported 4 UN officials who are working on this pandemic. So firstly, we keep track, and then we demand that they stop this harassment and restriction, which is what human rights activists are doing all over the world. And we call on the support of our other governments. Naming and shaming and exposing these violations, I think, is important, because some of these countries are dependent on aid and assistance from other countries. And this should be one of the conditions, that you cannot violate the human rights standards when you are monitoring ordinary people under the guise of COVID infections.
That makes sense, to tie it to, it's sort of a carrot and stick in that instance of you tie it to something that they need in the hopes of changing the behavior that you wish to change.
Yeah, although I should say, Kristan, when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights, there was, I was in 78 countries personally, and you see things on the ground. And so you do not easily call upon states to tie in human rights conditions with their aid, because I could see for myself that that would adversely impact people on the ground. You can't say don't give country A food because that the government is bad. Yes.
Right.
So with that caution, I would say it is still the stick to use to ensure against violations of people's fundamental freedoms.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, so you don't want to exacerbate the problem or exacerbate other problems while you're trying to change or solve this problem.
Yes.
Let's talk about perhaps some of the groups who might be disproportionately impacted at this. So I know you have done a lot of, or you're a tireless advocate for women and girls. So let's start with, are there instances where females might be disproportionately affected during this pandemic?
Oh, yes, you're looking at one, older persons. So, yeah, so last week I signed this campaign document that reached me from Italy. calling for protection of the elderly. And I read it through and I thought, yes, I can see that happening in many states where they place the elderly at the bottom of the line in respect of medications, hospitalizations, and so on. In fact, some governments have told the elderly, don't try to come to the hospital because we are treating younger people first. And so this campaign has said, you know, the elderly have contributed so much to society, and now they're dependent on the state for services and food and other and their health. Don't let them down now. So I thought that was a good document.
Yes, absolutely. I recall reading some news stories coming out of Italy and even New York City that were explaining sort of how they might be prioritizing patients and patient care. So yes, I can.
There's even a cynical articulation that the elderly are prone to die anyway of the virus. So why invest good money on their well-being? The focus should be on saving the lives of younger persons. So what we find is that they are now abandoned in high-risk institutions. And in developing countries such as my country, they're really in a poorly condition in terms of medical food supply, but above all, no visits from their families. So the United Nations independent expert on the rights of older persons has warned that social distancing must not become social exclusion, and that decisions on healthcare must be made on medical needs and not on non-medical criteria such as age or disability. So that's another group that they put at the bottom of the line, persons with disabilities.
Yes. And is the resolution you were just talking about binding universally? Is it just for people who have signed on to it? Is it just a guideline? What sort of force and effect does this have?
Oh no, these are the actions I said that civil society is taking.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, thank you.
It spreads widely. Why? Because of social media, WhatsApp, and all these others. Now millions get to hear about it, and governments get very worried when civil society gathers in huge numbers like that. But however, you mentioned women. Yes, everybody's concerned about the fate of women. They've always been in a vulnerable situation. They already are disadvantaged in communities. And so they're likely to bear the brunt of the worst effects of the virus because they not only fall into the vulnerable group in peace times, but also in conflict times. They are the primary carers of families. They are the ones responsible for securing food, shelter, and health needs. And this happens whether they are in rural areas, growing food, in the forest, gathering food, or even rushing to supermarkets, standing in long lines to get the food, getting transport to get there. So we say that they face these stress and deprivations, and that women are disproportionately affected. They do bear a heavier burden because they are disadvantaged by the existing socioeconomic positions, and they face the heightened risk of gender-based violence. Now, I have to mention this because I've also been keeping track of the numbers. The increase of violence against women and children in homes has increased astronomically. And yet the COVID measures ask them to stay locked in with the abuser. The UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, together with 4 UN independent experts, have expressed concern at this very likelihood of increase in rates of widespread domestic violence as situations of abuse worsen considerably in cases of lockdowns, they say. Worse because there are no or fewer shelters, worse because there's no health service, community support, or police protection. And among this group of women, those who are at even higher risk are LGBTI women, women with disabilities, and of course, undocumented migrants and victims of trafficking.
Of course. Are there
So what,
recommendations for
yeah.
ways to mitigate some of these challenges? Or, obviously not an easy solution, since the ultimate guideline is try not to leave your house. So, what are some of the ways that this can be addressed?
Yeah. So what we say is, please don't use the COVID-19 virus as an excuse to suspend these essential protection services for women and children who are being battered in their homes. So all the safeguards have to be maintained. They have to have access to protection orders, to advice officers, to hotlines, and they have to have access to safe shelters. The state now has to provide these shelters, and especially, as I mentioned, that they include trafficked women and migrant women and LGBTI women.
Absolutely. So as you know, we are obviously recording this a little bit in advance of Thursday. It's Monday, May 18th. Because tea time for me is actually fairly late in the evening for you. And so not an ideal tea time for you. And so we had asked people to submit some questions in advance of our chat today. And I actually did get a number of questions regarding human trafficking and its relation to human rights, and what are people seeing? Is this, although with the restrictions on movement, is there a concern that human trafficking will be increasing during this time because that monitoring might not be as prevalent as well?
Oh yes, I think we all experiencing increased levels of violence during this time because law enforcement is occupied elsewhere. They're busy arresting people for not wearing a mask. Yeah, in our country, they were about to arrest a child for wandering onto the beach sands, because you can walk along on the promenade, but not on the beach. So they're busy with other things, right? Important and otherwise. And so there's an increased level of crime. In fact, just before the lockdown, I was in London, where there were the stabbing of Asians.
Mm-hmm.
So that was xenophobic attacks against Chinese, and similar attacks, I think, and knife stabbings in the United States. Here, there's a great deal of violence. Unfortunately, in my province here alone, 24 schools have been burned and all the equipment stolen. So that's why I would expect that the criminals will take advantage of it. There's a great deal of illicit trading in tobacco and liquor, for instance. And illicit trade in tobacco, alcohol is always accompanied by trafficking in women and labor trafficking, because it's almost the same actors and they use the same funding.
Gotcha. I had not considered that those pathways would be that similar for goods and people make sense, but the fact that it's tied specifically to tobacco and alcohol and then human trafficking as well. I guess if you have found a route that enables you to skirt the law, then pretty much anything can pass through that route. That's interesting. We had a tea a couple of weeks ago with Professor Robert Tsai, where we were talking about the impact on people of Asian descent by virtue of calling this the China virus. And so some of what that has, some of the, as you mentioned, the stabbing, some of the other, spittings, general verbal assaults, in addition to physical assaults as well, that has disproportionately impacted Asian populations and non-majority Asian cultures as a result.
Yes, that's a fact. Not so much here in my country. We have other major crises arising from poverty and discrimination. And, like 40% of the population is unemployed. So we have other challenges. However, I agree, criminality has increased and special steps have to be in place to guard against this. I would say for trafficking, I don't know if you have any questions, it's very important that we put out the information. I can't tell you the number of cases where there would have been official denials. There were official denials. until somebody produced, some small person had taken a video. So this incident of a child being arrested was captured on video. The authorities were jumped in to deny it, but there's the video footage. So
Yes.
that's how we all have to keep our eyes open for the protection of people at risk of being trafficked.
Yes, and then have the courage to share what we are witnessing as well. So it's both the keeping track and then actually taking that step forward of, I saw this and this isn't right.
Yes, and we putting it forward because we want protection. You see,
Yes.
we want protection for those individuals. Many times the authorities, well, of course, they're preoccupied with this crisis, but they also are very concerned with the image of the country. They don't like any bad news going out there. Yes. Continually praise ourselves. And that's not the role of human rights activists. And we all in the COVID crisis have become human rights activists.
Absolutely.
Because if something happens to some victim, that touches all of us.
Absolutely. Well, and because as I think we have heard before, the protection of sort of the weakest of your group is often only the first step, because if you're not stopping things when they start, then that can escalate. And so it's, you know, it's coming for different groups that you thought were protected until all of a sudden it's perhaps your group. So easier to nip it in the bud. And that's why one reason why we should all be aware. You know, the fact that it's not impacting me directly in this instance doesn't make my concern any less necessary, because I and everyone needs to be vigilant about this.
Yes. And we all adopted these standards of human rights protections, and states have undertook obligations to implement those standards. So we often say states are the duty bearers here, and we, the public, are the rights holders. We can demand that they fulfill their obligations. But you put it very nicely. Yes, something happening in the remotest area is of concern to all of us.
Thank you. So you had mentioned perhaps some particular challenges that South Africa and other developing nations are experiencing that for those of us in the first world nations, we might not be aware of. So could you explain that a little bit more as well?
Well, for instance, if you ask me, of course, we all have complaints about being locked in your homes, but it's pathetic to complain about the fact that you know, you can't go to the shops, or you can't go to a hairdresser, for instance. When you have situations as here and in Africa and many parts of Asia, the number one problem is poverty. And so you see millions, 14 million people in South Africa unemployed, and I think 10 million are on social grants. The social grants in this country are about like $30 a month.
Wow.
So even those grants, yeah, they shouldn't be token, but what can developing countries do? They're limited by budgets and so on. And so you will not complain when you see, as we do on television, lines of poor people, elderly people on crutches, they're standing in long lines, waiting to access the, you know, a supermarket, or waiting to access the social grants office, and at the end of the day being turned away because there was not enough money or the computer's not working. Now I see after this was seen on media, they put chairs and so on for the elderly. So that's the other thing about when the public sees this and is conscience stricken, then the authorities act to be more humane in their methods. So that it's such a challenge, and I think this is why I so much support the fact that there must be global action. No single country can solve this problem. And this is why even now, as I did as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I think there's an obligation on rich countries to help provide medical equipment and extra food to developing countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and in the last few weeks, I feel as if we have seen a number of guidelines. They tend to come out regionally, but they speak to each other. So the Secretary General of the Council of Europe issued a toolkit regarding human rights. In the US, I guess a little over a week ago, almost 2 weeks ago, we had two laws that have been introduced, which authorize funds for programs that support democratic institutions and defenders of human rights. And I think they also require the State Department and USAID to monitor responses to the pandemic and counter attacks. And then the Africa Commission on Human and People's Rights has also issued a number of statements. In those, they seem to tend to be more expressing concern over some of the things that they are seeing on the African continent and some of the rights that are being infringed.
Actually, South Africa also has received assistance from reports I've read from the United States. The US ambassador announced a gift of ventilators that this country is short of. Now there are other countries like South Sudan, I understand, has just one ventilator.
Wow.
So you just can't compare the lack of resources with that oversupply of resources. So I would like the authorities to address the needs of people like this on the ground, to address the needs of the numbers rather than whether you can buy open sandals or closed shoes. You know, these are the middle class concerns.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one thing the pandemic seems to have made even more stark is that resource limitation, and sort of the separation between those who have the means and the capability and the resources to come through this not unscathed, but not as damaged as those who are without those resources.
Yeah. You know, my President Ramaphosa has been praised. He's even been praised by the US president for jumping into the situation and taking charge so soon. And part of the reason is that he has so much support. There is so much cooperation and solidarity amongst the people. So that's why it's working. But these initiatives need much more support. This is not the time for a country to say, you know, my country first, my people first. Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned that groundswell of support as well from the people. So it's not just the top down, it's also those being affected, impacted, and saying, maybe we don't like this, but we understand why it's happening, or we need you to take some action and we are willing to put up with some of the discomfort or challenges that come along with that.
Yes, people have for 2 months kept their children indoors, kept themselves out of work. Now, can you imagine, everybody here is reliant on that salary and they are without it. Businesses have lost massively. So that has happened in every country where there has been a lockdown. The country has raised funds. That's the other thing, that there's been huge generosity on the part of the public. They've given money for this, because you can't bear to see people without food. Then there are levels and levels of accusations of corruption in the distribution of that food. Yeah, human nature is there as well.
Yep.
So as I was saying, no state can solve this problem by unilateral action and protection only of their own population, because this is a global problem. And so I would say it's support for multilateralism. Now, you just mentioned the European Union and their statement. Yes, huge support for multilateralism from world leaders. And appeals have been addressed for this approach by the UN Secretary General, for instance, who's appealed for a stay in conflict and attacks during the conflict areas. And, you know, he couldn't get support for such a request at the Security Council. They wouldn't pass a reasonable request like that. Is, can you stop attacking civilians while we're attending to COVID? So that didn't happen. And may I mention also, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has called for easing of sanctions to help medical systems fight COVID-19. And these calls are crucial for states like Cuba, Zimbabwe, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela. Because once again, I return to my point, it's people who are suffering as a result of these sanctions. And the UN expert, there's a UN expert on unilateral coercive measures. And that expert has urged all governments to save lives by lifting all economic sanctions. So as the UN expert on the right to food has appealed for economic sanctions to end to prevent a hunger crisis. So this is at the global level why we, the population, expect them to foster international cooperation and assistance and share information, research, medical equipment. There is much concern now about a country developing a vaccine and not sharing that with other countries, yes, or not sharing the research. So there must be coordinated action to reduce these social economic impacts. And there should be joint endeavors by all states to ensure effective, equitable economic recovery, putting people first, I would say.
So, and to go back to what you were saying about the sanctions for a moment, is the argument against not lifting the sanctions really still limited just to not wanting to perhaps open up the door to that behavior continuing or starting up again? Or are there other arguments? Or I guess, how developed is that conversation at this point of people requesting the lifting of the sanctions or the end to sanctions and those who are not in favor of that?
Well, these are not United Nations sanctions we're talking about. United Nations sanctions, the ones that exist, for instance, on nuclear armament and so on with Iran, yeah, they're very specific. These are sanctions introduced unilaterally by rich governments, by certain countries against other countries. Now that affects the people in those countries. They do suffer, but I think the call by all the UN Secretary General and the experts is, please, during this time of crisis, people are going to starve to their death, or they're going to die of this illness if you don't lift the sanctions. I think that's an important call and it should be heeded.
So the argument is the argument isn't that they want to do away with the sanctions. The argument is, for right now, while we are trying to work through this challenge, this problem, let's not make it harder for people to get the food they need, the resources they need in order to survive this. And then once we are through this, if you governments who have imposed these sanctions feel as if they are warranted to perhaps be reimposed, let's consider it at that point.
Yeah, so that's it, Kristan. You've summarized it properly. It's a humanitarian call to suspend these sanctions now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you also seeing, as a result of this, impacts on the judicial system, or how, I guess, how is this, obviously the work of the tribunals is still continuing, and we'll talk about that in a moment because a fairly important event happened this past weekend. But in the U.S., we're experimenting now with some virtual trials. Obviously, the Supreme Court is all meeting remotely, and they've opened up their arguments so anybody can listen in. What other impacts are you seeing as a result of this, and how might that be playing into human rights?
It's such a basic right to have access to justice. If there's a violation, you want to go to court. But the courts are now closed. They're forced to close, once again, to keep crowds out. My sister is a senior magistrate, and they deal with a great deal of cases relating to sexual violence against children, for instance. So even in emergency situation like that, she goes to court some days, but otherwise it's the high courts, Supreme Courts, constitutional courts are resorting to the electronic media to hold virtual hearings. I suppose they select the more urgent ones, the more COVID-19 restricted ones. There's applications of overreach. that some of the measures are not reasonable. Business, I think, has come up with objections. One party wants all the restrictions lifted. You know, there are level 5 to level 1. We were in 5, now in 4. Someone wants us to jump to 1. So the courts are open for this, and that's very important. I mean, it's truly alarming to each one of us if we can't seek justice. I would say it's temporarily constrained at the moment. I like that the authorities have responded to the World Health Organization call to limit the number of prisoners, to let them out if possible, and countries are doing that because, you know, they've been sentenced by a court, they haven't been sentenced to die in prison.
Yes. We're having a conversation in a few weeks.
And there too, there's 2 points of view. The public is concerned if you release a whole lot of people who had been convicted for crime.
Of course.
Yes.
Yep. Yes.
The debates go on, and access to justice is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, as you mentioned, it is a basic fundamental right. That when you have when you have a problem, that there is a way to address it and some recourse.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you what concerns me as a former lawyer and judge is, you know, all justice has to be meted out in public. So there have to be public hearings. So you can't have public hearings now. You're holding it. Yeah, you're holding it.
There's a modification to what public means at this point.
Yes. The public is the risk, and they are at risk also.
Yes. Well, and I touched on this just a little bit. So over the weekend, Felician Kabuga, who created the Hutu militias and helped finance the Rwandan genocide, if I'm characterizing that correctly, he was arrested in Paris. And this is more than 20 years after the ICTR began its work. And I believe that you told me you signed his indictment originally.
I think I signed the indictment because I was the first judge to sign those first indictments, very early days. Now the tribunal, the Rwanda tribunal has come to an end, but the Security Council set up a mechanism, and Serge Brammertz is the person in charge. And I think I know that he was pursuing suspects. Even I had given up. So 23 years after the genocide, looks like Serge got the help of the French government. Yes. So that's in all these endeavors, you need international support to further the cause of justice. And someone who's alleged to be implicated to such an extent, almost like he's the person who funded this genocide, the radio station, the machetes, he bought all those machetes. Those are the allegations. No matter how old he is or how distant it is from the occurrence of the crime, it's important that justice is done.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, that international cooperation was certainly critical to making this happen.
Yes.
Right.
However, did I recall to you, yes, maybe in our earlier conversation, that the United States played a wonderful role in trying to arrest Kabuga in Nairobi, because I was right next door in the court at Tanzania, and we followed these events. They got so close to him, the security personnel from the US, and they were supposed to grab him at a house meeting with the businessman. Instead, somebody must have informed, and I think there were 1 or 2 people were killed there in that attempt. It was just too sad. I felt it because it was very fresh in my mind at that time. And so there you are, the long arm of the law will catch you sometimes.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think the articles I were reading mentioned that he had eluded capture twice before. And so one of those was probably the one you just mentioned. They didn't go into details for those. But yes, you know, we had Jim Johnson on a couple of weeks ago and talking about the tribunals in general, and some, you know, I don't think some people realize just how long some of these have been going on. And you're right, while sort of the main part of the ICTR has closed, there are these residual mechanisms that are still coming behind and continuing the work.
So I think great wisdom on the part of the Security Council to establish these residual mechanisms.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Navi, those are all of the questions that we had. I really appreciate you taking the time to have tea with me today. I am having a rooibos tea in honor of South Africa. I've been trying to make my teas thematic, so rooibos made sense since you are in South Africa. But I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Okay, thanks so much. Next time you owe me, you do owe me a cup of tea.
I will happily pay that debt. In fact, I have not been to South Africa yet, and so perhaps I will bring the tea to you.
Yeah. Well, you know, Kristan, thank you so much for doing this, but also for the, you know, outreach in educating people that the Robert Jackson Center is doing. I was surprised when you called me because I'm busy doing some other work for wildlife. We've got to watch out for wildlife and all the poaching that's going on. So I'm busy doing that. And I thought, do I want to have a tea conversation? And I thought, without hesitation, of course I will, because I've been there to the center and I do admire the work you're doing. Congratulations on your assumption of the presidency.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have just completed my first year, so it's certainly the last couple of months have been very interesting, but it's been an amazing first year. And you know, I should probably tell our audience I met you at the International Humanitarian Law Roundtable last August at Chautauqua, which was my first experience with hearing those conversations and really starting to get a grasp of all of the work that goes into that and the questions that people are still wrestling with. And that you provided the keynote address for that last year. And that was just, it was an amazing talk. And just, I admire you so much. So thank you very much for taking the time.
All right. Thank you, Kristan. And my best wishes to your audience.
Thank you very much, Navi.